Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Let me put the logo up temporarily here. I have to remove that because sometimes the when people get on here and chat, it covers up the messages, and I want to be able to read your messages. But welcome to another Shamanic Coffee Hour, and today I'm gonna talk about shamanism, um, which is right in a line with this being Shamanic Coffee Hour and whatnot. I do know from having done these in the past that good morning, welcome again. The peak time, for whatever reason, the peak time that people seem to join is 7 minutes in whenever I start. I don't know if that's a technology thing, has to do with YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're watching this from. But we're on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and where else? Somewhere else. Twitch, which I realize is primarily, I mean, somebody always comes in and watches from Twitch, but primarily it's, uh, I think for video gamers, right? Twitch. I don't know that much about Twitch, other than I'm broadcasting there. So, anyway, welcome. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk a lot completely. Hopefully, if I keep my brain on straight, my ADHD brain. Um, I like to describe. Some people use the term neurodivergent. I like to use the term neurospicy. Um, Seems a little bit better. But good morning if you've just joined. Um, if you're interested, I'm drinking out of my Hustle Juice mug, and I'm drinking Pete's coffee this morning, which is delightful. And I'm going to talk about shamanism. I'm going to talk about what shamanism is, where it comes from, what the word means, what shamans do, and we'll talk a little bit about how shamanism fits into a spiritual path or can fit into a spiritual path. I'm not recommending shamanism as a spiritual path for anybody. Um, if it's for you, it's for you. If it's not for you, it's not, it's clearly not for you. So, um, take the logo down for now. Uh, so if shamanism's not for you, it's not a great path for you, but it has a lot to offer, and so I will talk about that a little bit, and I will show if you're really interested in the sort of the academic side of that. This is the seminal work on shamanism, and I believe I can definitely pronounce this gentleman's last name, Eliade Merchea. Actually, I don't know if it was a man or a woman. I think it was a man. Anyway, Eliade wrote this book called Shamanism: Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, and that really is the seminal work. There are lots of books about shamanism, and they kind of take two different tacks. One is very instructional, right? There are a lot of sort of how-to books on shamanism, which are interesting, and they run the gamut from kind of new agey to good morning. Oh, he's a man. Okay, thank you for clearing that up. I thought so, um, but I've only ever read his name and heard him mentioned, but I haven't seen pictures or interviews or anything. Actually, I don't think there's a picture. Yeah, there's no picture on the book of the author. So, um, but this is the that if you're really into academic reading, this is it. It's about I don't know, it's about 500 pages, well researched book on shamanism. And I take a lot of my definition of shamanism from his definition of shamanism, although not completely, but his is an academic view of shamanism, where my view is less academic and more as a practitioner and somebody who has chosen shamanism as my, or I should say, for somebody for whom shamanism has chosen. That's a weird. I'll say the path chose me more than I chose it. I don't know that I'll have time to get into my whole story or that it's that interesting to anybody else, but it definitely wound up being a path that chose me as opposed to, I'm looking around for something, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. I was sort of thrust into it. And that's one of the things that happens. A lot of people who start out because of some sort of illness or crisis. And I'll talk about that. I will talk a little bit about my story just because it fits into the whole picture of things. Not that I think that my story is particularly interesting, but let's uh, let's talk about shamanism. One of the things I like to do whenever I talk about a subject is define my terms, right? What do I mean when I say shamanism? What do I mean when I say, you know, the word shaman or whatever? What do I mean? Not because my definition is better than anybody else's or supersedes anybody else's or is better than yours. But just so you know what I think I'm talking about, right? It's just a communication tool when I define things that I'm talking about. When I say, to me, this is what shamanism is, that's to me. So, shamanism, I'll talk about, I'll define it, I'll talk about where the word comes from and sort of the linguistic quagmire we find ourselves in with the term shaman or shamanism. Um, there's a lot of sort of reductionists thinking about the origins of shamanism. Oh, it's Siberian because the word shaman comes from Siberia, so it's Siberian. That's it, and that's not true. It's very, reductionist. The words, the words dungarees, I realize people don't use that anymore. It just popped into my head. Come from India, but blue jeans. That doesn't mean your blue jeans were, your blue jeans necessarily in the way that they show up today are from India or something that resembles what they call dungarees in India. So the term doesn't necessarily indicate everything about something. And I'll talk about the linguistic aspect. So let's talk about shamanism. And if you have any questions along the way, post them. At least if you're on YouTube or Facebook, your questions and comments will come up in the chat area, and I should be able to read and respond to those. Um, if you're watching the recording of this, you can post questions too, and I will respond to them. So let's talk about what shamanism is. And I like to define shamanism in three ways, sort of three ideas about shamanism. The first, if we take it from here, is that shamanism is a set of spiritual tools that are ancient, prehistoric. We don't know how far shamanism goes back. Anybody who is talking about the origins of shamanism, like, and slaps a date on it, that's purely speculation. We can't know because it predates predates writing, but we see evidence of shamanic practice in, cave and rock art, for example, that's tens of thousands of years old. There is uh, some evidence of shamanic practice going back 300,000 years to an area where that means it wasn't even necessarily anatomically modern human beings, right? There's a cave, a Kesem cave in um, Israel, and they found some, they found some bone of some animal that had been used in ritual, and there's some extrapolation there into shamanic practice. Who knows? But research is ongoing about that. But it's a practice that's seen all over the globe. The term is different, obviously, the term that people use, but we have shamanism. We have shamans in Asia, for example. We have shamans in Africa. We have shamans in the Americas. So shamans in Australia. Do you think shamanism chooses the person, like going through a spiritual awakening and feeling the push to use gifts? Um, uh, I do think that shamanism chooses the person. I will say that I have gone through years and years and years of training. I did an apprenticeship, and I did 2 years of initiatory training and a bunch of specialized training, and then I did 2 years of teachers training. And um, of those people who go through all of that training, not everybody winds up practicing, or, you know, so today in modern times, you can go learn shamanism. You can go take a class, right? Anybody can sign up for an intro to shamanism class and take it and learn the technique. But is that your path? Is that your, you know, so what happened for me was I jumped into an apprenticeship before knowing really much about shamanism, and I'm like, I'm going to try this out. Not it was a little more there's a little more to it than that. That spirit was telling me I needed to go find a teacher and do this. And it was, when I got there, it was home. Like, this is okay, this is my home. This is my path. But yeah, spirit, I would say that spirit really pushes people into choosing the path. Sometimes the messages from spirit are rough. Sometimes you go through a crisis. And I'll talk about shamanic crisis in just a little bit, but definitely it is one of those things where crisis, and I'll talk about that as the third way that I describe shamanism, as this impulse to awaken spiritually. um but yeah, definitely spirit chooses you. If this is the path for you, it spirit will choose you. This isn't to say that anybody can't go take a course in shamanism and learn some of the tools. You can. You just won't fall into it as a life path if it isn't meant for you, because it's not easy. Shamanism, I sometimes joke, shamanism ain't for wimps. um Shamanism is a rough path. It will shake up your life. It will pull up the parts of you that, if you stick with it, it will pull up the dark parts of you and force you to confront them. Um, which is, for me, fantastic. Hard, difficult, not easy, but not everything that's easy and pleasant is the right thing for us, right? Sometimes you have to take your medicine, and this is spiritual medicine. So, yeah, I mean, I've had my life turned upside down several times along my shamanic path. But in hindsight, it's all like, oh, yeah, I needed to get shaken awake at that point. I was being really dense. So, I'll talk about, like, when I talk about the third aspect, the third way that I describe shamanism, this will come into play for sure. So, um, so the first way is this archaic archaic techniques of ecstasy, as Eliade writes about. Um, the practice of shamanism involves three components. If you don't have these three components, you're not really doing what we call shamanism. You're doing something else, which is fine, and it might be an adjunct to shamanism. Right. So, for example, some people might do energy healing along with shamanism, or you might meditate. Meditating isn't shamanism. It's not a particularly shamanic practice, but there's nothing that says a shaman can't meditate. It's just that that's not part of the core practice. There's a core set of things. And this isn't to say that, you go to an indigenous culture and there's a shaman and they're doing some ceremony that doesn't involve these three components, that they're not doing shamanism. It's just that there is this tradition, a bunch of traditional aspects to what they're doing. But when we're talking sort of academically about shamanism, there's three components. Shamans, people practice shamanism, use an altered state of consciousness or trance. Okay. There is a specific altered state of consciousness. We have research about this. We have shamanic practitioners who uh, have been hooked up to EEG machines, so we know that this is a unique state of consciousness that shamans are able to enter. There are different ways that they do this depending on the culture. Some cultures dance to go into this trance. Many cultures use rhythm, such as drumming. You'll see that a lot in Mongolian Siberian shamanism. And some shamanic cultures use um, chemicals. They use entheogens, hallucinogens, psychedelics, whatever term you want to lay to it. So psilocybin, peyote, ayahuasca, they'll use certain chemicals to go into an altered state. Um, you don't need chemicals to enter the shamanic state of mind. I don't do that myself. I use drumming generally, or a rattle. So we'll use rhythm, but there's a specific state of mind that shamans are able to enter that allows them to um, navigate in the spiritual worlds, essentially leave the body and enter into spiritual worlds. So that's component number 2. So we call that non-ordinary reality. So ordinary reality is the stuff you see around you in the 3D world when you're awake. Non-ordinary reality involves everything else, all the spiritual worlds, and there are, as far as I know, an infinite number of those. But there are 3 main worlds, 3 main divisions that most shamanic people work with, up and we call that upper world, lower world, and middle world. And I'll save discussions of the shamanic worlds for another talk. But um, so shamans go into an altered state of consciousness. It allows them to separate part of their consciousness from their body, essentially. Um, ultimate spiritual reality is consciousness is non-local. So this is a natural thing that anybody can do. In fact, you do it sometimes when you're dreaming anyway. But this the journey, which is what we call this, um, shamans have more control over it than most people do, and that's what sets them apart. They can choose to enter this state of mind. They can choose which world they go to. They can choose what they do there. That requires some training. So that is the practice. Um, so altered state of consciousness, navigate in spiritual realms, spiritual worlds other than the 3D reality. And the third part is shamans work with what we call helping spirits. Helping spirits are a broad category of spirit, and they range from what some people call spirit animals, we call power animals. Power animal really is kind of a different term than a spirit animal. Spirit animal is usually just some informal thing that people have a connection with. I really like wolves. I really like ravens, I really like whatever. Okay. So I identify with that. So that's my spirit animal. But a power animal is a specific spirit of a specific animal that lived and died, crossed over, and has volunteered to work with you for spiritual reasons. And so shamans have usually more than one power animal. They usually have a main power animal and then other power animals they work with to do certain things like healings and divination. So that's one form of helping spirit. There are lots of different helping spirits. We'll have ancestral helping spirits. So your ancestors will, who have obviously gone before, will come back and help and work with you. There are others. List is too long to get into, but most shamanic people will have many, many helping spirits that they'll work with. Those are the three components of the first aspect, the first way that I talk about or define shamanism. It's that set of practices that are cross-cultural, that are written about in books like this one, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques. I'm not selling this book, by the way. I don't like if you're not really interested in reading an academic work on shamanism, that would not be the book for you. If you just want to like learn a few things about shamanism or learn some techniques, that wouldn't be the number one choice. It's okay. It's not going to teach you techniques, but it's a great academic research. I have a rather large collection of books, many about shamanism. Um, but that's the way that it's described academically, and that series of practices is cross-cultural and crosses over millennia. So human beings have been practicing shamanism since prehistory. Um, so the second way, which kind of leads me into the second way that I talk about and define shamanism. What is shamanism? And that is shamanism encompasses a certain worldview. And this worldview is shared by, it's not a singular, easy to define worldview, but there are components of this worldview that are shared amongst every shamanic culture, amongst every shamanic practitioner. And that worldview includes a couple of things. A, it stems from animism. Shamanism stems from animism. Probably animism came before shamanism. We don't know. There are people who will state animism came before shamanism. There's no way to know that, unless you can go back and interview people from 300,000 years ago. But it seems likely, but we don't know for sure. And animism is the belief in spirits, but not just spirits of the dead, spirits of what we consider like animals and that sort of thing, but everything having a spirit. So the trees, the rocks, the rivers, the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, all actually being spirits, but having physical representation, right? And in shamanism, there are lots of spirits that don't have physical bodies. We work with lots of spirits that don't have physical bodies. But so the shamanic worldview encompasses animism for one thing. And there will be also this sense of, and it's expressed in different ways depending on the culture, this sense of interconnection between all, at least all living beings, but between all things, that everything underneath it all is connected. There are lots of spiritual systems that will describe like the web of life or the net or the weaving of fate. There things that are woven together like threads are very, very common in many mythologies and spiritual systems. And you have the fates, the three fates in Greek paganism, for example, and one is spinning the wool into thread, and the other one is taking the thread and weaving that into a long cloth, and then the other one is snipping the cloth to represent an ending to things. So that is, in Norse mythology, we have the web of weird. In Buddhism, we have Indra's net. So all of these spiritual systems recognize an interconnectedness, and that comes out in shamanism. And then I would say the third worldview or belief or value that comes out of shamanism that's really important is reverence for the natural world. And that really an understanding that we are, as human beings, we are a part of nature. Now, most of us live in modern homes, drive cars, buy our food at a grocery store, all of these things. So we sometimes feel disconnected from nature, but we are as much a part of nature as the trees and the birds and the bees. It's just that we feel sometimes because we can protect ourselves from the elements, and most of us are not out catching our food or foraging, although, I know people who forage, but not for all of their food. Most of us don't forage for all of our food or grow all of our food or, all of those things. Most of us aren't walking barefoot through the forest. Yeah, there are cultures that are doing that. They're very, very close to nature. And the natural world is extremely, extremely important because they recognize how the survival of the human species is dependent upon protecting nature and natural resources because we're interdependent. So that's the second component is the worldview in the way that I described shamanism. So we have the practice, the things that shamans do. We have the kind of the worldview. There's no shamanism is not a religion, so there's no doctrine, there's no dogma, but there is sort of a general worldview that most people who practice shamanism because you recognize certain spiritual truths just in your practice. And the third component, and this is what you were asking about, was it has to do with what you were asking about. If shamanism chooses the person, like going through a spiritual awakening. Absolutely. And so the third way that I describe shamanism is about this shamanic impulse to awaken spiritually that happens usually as the result of some sort of crisis. That can be a personal crisis, like a health crisis or a mental health crisis. It can be a tribal crisis, like trauma, in a family group or in a tribe, or it can be a global crisis like a pandemic, for example. You know, During the pandemic, a lot of people turn to spirituality of different forms, whatever form. I'm not saying necessarily shamanism, but a lot of people turn to that as a source of strength, as a resource, and shamanism is no different. So there are shamanic cultures that to be chosen to train as a shaman, you have to have gone through some sort of trauma, whether that is, an illness or, you were struck by lightning, something like that. There are other cultures that will put you through what's called an ordeal, meaning very, very tough circumstances. They're essentially forcing traumatic experiences on you to uh, create the spiritual effect for shamanic awakening. And most people, the majority of people that I know who actively practice shamanism have some history of trauma or crisis. A lot of people come into it because of a health crisis, and I was definitely in crisis when I came to shamanism, and that was part of my story, which I've told my story quite a lot. I'm not going to go too in depth into it today. Another day if people are interested, if people are really interested. Um, but yeah, there's this impulse to awaken that comes. You go through a crisis and it shakes you apart, and you turn to spirituality of some form, in my case, shamanism, to put yourself back together. In shamanism, there's something called dismemberment, which is what it sounds like. You're being taken apart, but then you're remembered. You're put back together, and that's important because this is think about repairing a car engine or something, right? You have to dismantle. You don't call it dismembering, but you have to dismantle this engine. You have to take it apart so that you can do the work that needs to be done and then put it back together. And it's better once you put it back together. It's healed, it's more complete. So dismemberment in shamanism is about being taken apart so that you can, or shaken apart so that you can be put back together in a way that serves you spiritually. So those are the three ways that I just sort of describe shamanism. I'll talk a little bit about where the word shaman comes from, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, um, because people will say the word shaman is a Siberian word, and that is true. Um, the word shaman is a Siberian word. It came into English actually at the end of the 17th century. It's been in English usage for hundreds of years. So I actually consider it an English word with with foreign origin. Um, and we have lots of words in the English language that have foreign origins. what people will do will say, because the word shaman is Siberian, you can't use it because that's cultural appropriation. Um, we could debate that, but the word shaman has been in use in the English language since, since the late 1600s, early 1700s. It came into English from German and Russian, actually. There was an envoy from Germany that went to Siberia in the 1600s, and or actually, no, not from Germany. He went from, I think it was Dutch. However it happened, a European emissary went to Siberia, met some Siberian shamans, and that's the first evidence of Europe that we have of Europeans writing about that, writing using the word shaman. However, so obviously they got it from these the Tungus people of Siberia, who have shamans and whatever, and you know there are shamans in Mongolia, but the word for that is different. The word for shaman is it's different for men and for women. Actually, they have male and female shamans, and the terms are different. But I think the word for male shaman is bo. I could be mispronouncing that, but it's like BOO, but with an accent over one of the O's. And there's a different term for female shaman. Um, so yes, different cultures will have different words, but many cultures have adopted that word. If you go to Google Translate and you try to find translations of the word shaman in different languages, most of them will be very close to the word shaman. And in fact, when we in English we use the word shaman, it's probably not exactly like the word they use in Siberia. It's probably a close approximation. So the word did come from there, but before that, where did it come from? Like, did the Tungus people just invent it, just make that word up out of thin air? Well, that seems unlikely, given that we see forms of that word in Sanskrit, in Pali, in Chinese, in Aramaic, in Hebrew. And so that word, shaman, and it has sort of connotations that are similar. So in Pali, for example, shaman means like ascetic monk. In Chinese, it means like it's another term for a monk or a holy person. Um, and that's kind of the meaning. It's a religious functionary or spiritual functionary in these different cultures. And so that word seems to have an origin that probably predates any of these languages. Probably comes from some mother tongue. I don't know that linguists have found that yet. Part of the problem is the language. There's a lot of debate about the language the Tungus people speak, Tungsik, and what its origins are. And i- there's a mother tongue there that some people have postulated that others are debating. And so the linguists can argue back and forth about where the roots of the language. Eventually, there'll be enough linguistic research to show that. But linguistics is really fascinating, because it shows how words change over time, how they trace it back, and they're able to reconstruct a lot of things, like Proto-Indo-European. So the people that lived across Europe and went into India, and might have they don't even necessarily know where they originated, but they had domesticated horses and they were nomadic, and the language spread all over, and that's why we have European languages that have common words, common sounds, common root words with languages like Sanskrit. Um, it's really cool. And I realized like the whole Indo-European thing, I won't get too far into that, but has been used by sort of like racist white supremacists for a while, since actually since Germany. It was used to justify sort of a lot of the Nazi propaganda about race and all that stuff. They definitely mistook and molded and warped the research around that. Um, Regardless, anyway, not to go too far off on a tangent, but the word shaman, if you ask what it means in its mother tongue, I have seen maybe 20 different answers. From one who sees clearly, one who sees in the dark, wise person, elder, all of these. I've seen all kinds of different terms about what it means in the Tongsic language. It seems to be one of those things where you say, what does the word priest mean? Um, you know, Well, we could take the origins of that, right? And I don't know what they are, but we take the origins of that and break it apart. But we know what a priest is. We know what a priest does. So we know what a shaman is. We know what a shaman does. Breaking the word apart into its roots might be interesting, but we don't necessarily need to know what that is. So talked about what shamanism is. Talked a little bit about the origins of the word shaman and where that comes from and how it came into English 300 or so or more years ago. And so while it is a loan word, it is an English word. You can look it up in a dictionary and get a definition. Um, you can look it up in an that isn't to say but to say, people speaking English can't use the word shaman because it doesn't belong to them. I've heard that. I've heard people say, "Well, that's not our word. I can't say that word." Well, if you cut out all of the words that English has ever borrowed from other languages, you'd have a very limited vocabulary. You'd have a challenge communicating. There's a lot of everything: French, Spanish, even Tagalog. The word boondocks, for example, comes from the Tagalog word for mountain. Um, so there's a lot of there's a lot of borrowed words in English. Over the centuries, there was a lot of cross cultural communication, and people didn't think, "Oh, we can't take that word. That word doesn't belong to us." We just, that's just how language. And I would say that that's true for just about every language. That there was, unless it's an ancient language that didn't evolve, most other languages borrow lots of terms. Any modern language is going to borrow a ton of terms. Um, from other languages. So it's kind of interesting. So the area that I grew up in Maine. I live in Maine now. There are a lot of people or there were not so many anymore, but there were a lot of people who spoke French when I was growing up in the area. These people were the descendants of people who were originally from France, came to Canada, and at some point, probably in the 19th century or early 20th century, migrated down to where I live to work in the mills. There were, mills here. There were textile mills and all that stuff. So there was work. So a lot of people emigrated down and formed little communities. And there were a lot of French speaking people who came here, but they came here um, and the language is very different than language even you would see now today in Quebec, or you would definitely see differences in languages from Parisian French. So my mother, for example, studied French in college, and I remember going with her when I was a kid into this boot shop, Marcel's boot shop, and the owner was French, and she spoke French to him, but she was speaking French. She was communicating in the French she had learned in college, which was Parisian French, and he corrected her. He corrected her French, but he was correcting it in what would not be considered proper French. So languages evolve; they borrow from others. So, you would hear people around here speaking in French, and they would pull English words in because, so for example, in France, in, Parisian French, a computer is an ordinateur, right? But these people migrated here before computers existed. So they would be speaking French at a, 1,000 words a minute, and all of a sudden you would hear the word computer, and then they'd keep going because they didn't have that word that, so there was an English borrowed word. So my whole point of this story is that languages evolve, they borrow from other languages. It's not, using the term shaman is not cultural appropriation. Um, you know, it's it is what it is. It's the word that we have for this set of practices. Maybe if we hadn't been using the word for 300 years in English, we would find a different word or invent one. But we would probably borrow it from another culture, right? We'd probably, there are shamanic cultures in the Americas, right? Native indigenous cultures that are shamanic. And to dispel a myth, not all not all indigenous cultures in the Americas are shamanic. You do have shamanic practice just about everywhere, but not in every single culture. It's not that universal. It's pretty universal in that it spans many, many cultures, and it's global. And so you see, shamans in Northern Europe amongst the indigenous people there. You see shamans in South America. You see shamans in Africa. You see shamans amongst the indigenous people of Australia. Um, so in that respect, it is very universal. So, what do we what do we do? What do we do? How do we use that word? So in my tradition, in the tradition that I was trained in, I am not allowed to call myself a shaman. So the way my teacher explained it to me, she said, "You can say that I'm your shaman, but I'm not allowed to say that." Um, and I have to trace that rule back a little bit. I still don't use that term in describing myself. I will say shamanic teacher, shamanic practitioner, um, or shamanic healer, or dude who practices shamanism. By the way, I think dude would be a great pronoun, because I know the history of dude, but I think the use of dude crosses all genders, I should say. So you can refer to anybody as dude these days, and um, can connote a lot of meaning depending on how you say it. Dude, right? You know that you can connote a lot of meaning in the tone in which you say the word dude. I think it's a perfectly wonderful word to call people by. Some people will differ with that. Anyway, um, so linguistically speaking, so in my tradition, there are people who are not from the teaching tradition that I belong to, who refer to themselves as shamans, and I don't say to them. I never talk about anybody else's practice really. There are Unless I see something that I think is unsafe, um, or really or incredibly unwise. Usually unwise means unsafe in this thing. If I see teaching that I feel like is unsafe, I might say something about that. Or, the use of dangerous psychoactive chemicals, without proper safety mechanisms or cultural understanding, and completely out of context recreationally, I'll talk about stuff like that. But that's dangerous stuff. But if somebody else uses the term shaman to describe themselves, I don't say, "Oh, don't do that. You're not allowed." It's not for me to do that. Spirit will take care of whatever spirit needs to take care of. The one time there is a tradition kind of in shamanism where, uh, if you have a teacher, they might sort of look out for what you're doing, look for ethical violations. My teacher's very, very strong on ethics. There have been a couple of times where there has been some confusion about something that somebody either asked me to do or something I was actually doing, and she would like immediately reach out and say, "Hey, I heard this, and can you tell me what's going on here?" And it turned out it was, in both cases that she reached out to me, it was a misunderstanding, but she's checking me, checking my ethics. I don't do that too much with my students. I make sure that they have solid ethics when I don't just take anybody as a student. We have to have a conversation first, and make sure we're a good fit. Fit is really important with shamanic teachers, by the way. So you can't no, you cannot just unless I'm teaching if I'm teaching an open class, yes, you can come sign up for it. But as far as taking students on one-on-one or whatever, you can't just sign up for that. And I would be hesitant to study with anybody. Again, you can go out and take all kinds of classes, and I do teach public classes. That's totally fine, but if somebody's taking you on as an apprentice or signing you up for, like, a lengthy program that's gonna involve a lot of one-on-one work or that kind of thing, I would be really hesitant to sign up with anybody who would just take anyone without some sort of process, without some sort of vetting process. And it doesn't have to be complex. There's like an interview and an application kind of thing. So when I decided I needed to learn shamanism, or when Spirit decided I needed to learn shamanism, I found my teacher and I contacted her, and she's like, "Oh, you're interested in this apprenticeship, but you did not take my intro course." And I just taught my last intro course for the year. I was like, "Oh." She goes, "Well, why don't you come meet with me?" And I had to fill out this before I met with her, I had to fill out this big long application, my life story, my spiritual goals, what psychological conditions I might suffer from, all of this stuff. Send it to her so she could read it. And then I went and I sat with her in her office for, I think it was about 3 hours, and talked. And she finally said, "I will accept you into my apprenticeship, but you have to do X, Y, and Z first, and you have to come to my office and do like a private there's a small group of us that had to do some private instruction with her before she'd let us into her apprenticeship." So it was a process, it was a vetting process. So that sort of thing, super, super important. But there is something with teachers checking their students' ethics, and I've known other well-known teachers who have done that, sometimes in pretty harsh ways, actually. Um, I'm a little bit more like, I'm going to give you the information you need to stay in good ethics, and if you step out, you're going to know that it's not me that's going to deliver any sort of consequence, but you're going to run the risk of running afoul of what Spirit wants, and Spirit can be a harsh teacher. There's this on kind of the new age side, there's this thing that spirits are all these like ascended angels and masters, and they want what's best for you, they want what's in your they spirits that were you're helping, spirits do want what's best for you. They want what's in your highest good. So if you're messing around ethically, your highest good might involve a significant crisis emerging in your life, so that you can learn to check your behavior before you harm others or harm yourself or do harm to the idea of shamanism, the spirit of shamanism. um your teachers might be like, "This person has a big head, they're very haughty, they're bragging, they're whatever, we're going to take them down a peg and show them that they need to be approach spirit with humility." And i've seen that I've seen that a lot. um uh there's a challenge because folk like me, I'm putting myself out there, right? I'm doing these, I have a podcast, I have I get interviewed a lot on podcasts and radio shows and TV shows and stuff. Um, so there's an egoic draw to that. I take a lot of I'm very satisfied about having these conversations with people. I take a lot of satisfaction out of that. Take a lot of satisfaction out of teaching. It's important for me to pull the ego back and say, I am not your guru. I know some stuff. I've been through some practices. I can lead you through some experiences, but I am not a replacement for your will or your knowledge or your whatever. And I'm not trying to build a new patriarchal system around shamanism. That's not it at all. And I tell my students, I'm like, big thing that a big teaching is, and this comes up a lot. I tell students, I'm like, okay, try this out, and they might try something, and they're like, oh, my helping spirit told me I should do this in a different way. Well, then do it in a different way. Like, I am not the expert on you, and so your helping spirits know more than I do. Their wisdom always supersedes anything I say. I'm just guiding you to different experiences and hopefully steering you clear of, pitfalls in training. That's how I see my job as a shamanic teacher, is to guide people to discover their own gifts and their own spirit and getting in touch with helping spirits, not to be um, you know, eh, not to be a replacement for people's wisdom or, their own learning or whatever. So I like to say I'm a guide, not a guru. And again, like, part of that is I have no egoic desire to be a guru type spiritual teacher whatsoever. I don't have the time for that. I don't have the wherewithal for that sort of thing. But I'm very happy to guide people to experiences. There is nothing more satisfying to me than when I'm teaching something and a student like gets it, and I see that, metaphorical light bulb go off over their head, or they have just a completely transformative experience and they're like, you know, wow, that was life changing. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing the life changing aspect of that. But my job is to guide people into places where they can have a life-changing experience, where they can learn some things. That's my role, and I don't ever want to step out of that role. It would be very egoic, and spirit wants you to, um, not be so attached to your ego, right? Ego is important. A lot of people talk about ego death or killing the ego or whatever. And I think I did a coffee hour talk about ego. I did not that long ago, actually. Um, Ego will pull us out of spiritual understanding. It plays an important role in that it protects the body and mind. That's ego's job, right? It makes us feel like I'm an individual disconnected from everything. Um, be I better be important and, seek out resources so that this body mind can survive. But sometimes that ego takes us away from our spiritual evolution, right? And so spiritual awakening is not about killing the ego or destroying the ego. It's about lessening our attachment to ego, meaning I no longer identify with my ego. The ego is just a set of stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. It's our ideas and beliefs about who we are. wrapped into this identification with this body, this stuff. And shamanism will pull you out of that. So before I go, the last thing I kind of want to talk about is um, the the different ways. There are a couple of different ways that you can approach the shamanic path. Traditionally, in an indigenous culture, if you were trained to be a shaman or selected to be a shaman, that would be your job. There were cultures in which the role of shaman was so important and so central, and still is, to the tribal community that shamans were forbidden to participate in certain activities like hunting or planting food. Focus on this, and the tribe is going to take care of you. Okay. So, in that case, there's no choice but for it to become your job. Most people I know these days who practice shamanism are not practicing it as a job. Um, most people who are practicing shamanism that I know personally, and I live in the US, I don't live in Siberia or Mongolia, um, practice it as a form of self spiritual development. And it's perfectly suited for that. So you can go down the professional path, you can become a shamanic healer. It's not easy. You can't do it in a weekend class. In fact, I think I did approximately 3 years of training and practice, including apprenticeship, training in soul retrieval. Um, I've had students who are like, I'm really interested in having a healing practice. And those are few and far between, actually. Those are the minority of people who study with me, want to actually open a healing practice of some sort. But if they do, I support them and I will focus their training on the things that they need to know for doing healing practice. And there's a lot. And I'll tell them, I'm like, it's a big curriculum. And the reason is that there are a number of things, there are a lot of things you can run into when you're working with clients that if you're not prepared for, um, the best case scenario is you're not going to be able to help them. The worst case scenario is you could cause some harm. Um, and so there's a lot of preparation for things you can't be prepared for. um, there's a lot of just understanding how to speak with clients, for example, and how to the sort of the nuts and bolts of it. But then there's a pile of sort of healing stuff, diagnostic tools, and all these things. It's not like a lot of energy healing systems, and in no way am I putting down any energy healing system. I'm just saying that it's different. So with Reiki, for example, you can go get attuned to Reiki in a weekend, right? You won't become I forget. There's 1, 2 levels, 1, 2, and 3, or whatever it is. You can go get attuned to Reiki in a weekend and learn what you need to do to go out and practice Reiki on people, and that's perfectly great and well and good. Shamanism is not like that. Um, Shamanism is very, very different than that, and there are lots of healing tools, and it goes very, very deep. It's not I lay my hands on somebody and I give, and I allow energy to pass through. Um, it's very different. It is a form of, spiritual healing. Sometimes there's energy work, but not always. And you definitely need to learn soul retrieval. Um, you know, Definitely need to learn soul retrieval. That in itself is not a weekend thing. That takes, at least I did 5 days of residential training just to learn that one practice. And by residential, I mean I stayed in in retreat, and we studied day and night and practiced, and had, I think there were multiple, there was my teacher, and she had multiple assistants to make sure everybody understood what they were doing, and went through so many processes, getting to the point where we could start to do soul retrieval for people. Soul retrieval is very, very deep healing. I'll talk about that in another coffee hour. Anyway, I've been chatting for about an hour. Thank you everybody for joining me again. I'll do another one of these. I think I'm going to do another one on Friday. I've been making it a habit of doing these regularly on Friday. I might try to do a couple of these a week as more people join in and have questions and things like that. So, anyway, I hope this is helpful, informative, and interesting. If you are, if you want to know when I'm doing these in the future, don't forget to subscribe or like or whatever, so you can be informed. And